In the age after the fall of the Orokin, the grand clade families of the Ostrons were cast wide across the solar system, roaming and homeless in their great floating markets. In this time, two young people were in love. The woman, Erfriha, and the man, Mirza. Erfriha was from the Yingbindunyai clade, meaning great bond, a very old and wealthy compact of bonded families. Mirza, however, had no clade, his family having been shattered by the Grineer many years before. He was Cetus, meaning landless, cladeless, a body turned to dust, turned to motes, on a careless wind. Efria belonged to families within families. Mirza was alone. But to Efrihar, Mirza was a poet who had eyes to see the beauty of things and ears to hear the softly whispered language of the universe. I know a place, he said, where I may be homeless no more. I have heard a voice, and it leads me there. Come with me. But Elfriha's father was a man made foolish by his wealth, and vociferously disapproved of their love. Mirza was cast adrift from the floating market that was home to his one true love. Elfriha and Mirza ran away together, as lovers do, and were never heard from again. Rent by grief, her family thought her dead. Her father passed away, clutching her cameo, at peace, thinking he would see her soon, in some moonlit afterlife. Decades later, ships entering ancient Earth's orbit were hailed from the planet's poisoned surface by an old woman's voice, gentle and knowing. Traders would call for her, greet her, offer the latest news on their families and lives, but never did they learn anything of this woman, save that she had a husband and they were, somehow, happy living on the toxic skin of that hostile world. The old woman would always ask those travelers of news of the Yingbindunyai clade. Yingbindunyai junkers came searching for a sign of their missing daughter. The frail voice of their long-lost child reached out to them, and there was much joy. You will find us, her message said, by the light of our love. Efriha bade them make their home around a magnificent Orokin ruin, promising them that it would be a source of prosperity for generations to come. The Yingbindunyai arrived in their vast floating market. There, by a ragged coastline, winked a point of light. Follow the brightness of the love between Mirza and I, said the message, and be safe from all harm. The wrathful Grineer took umbrage at this, and sought to block their passage, but upon approaching that ancient Orokin tower, found their transmissions silenced, their engines turned cold, and their weapons reduced to lumps of dead iron. She was a being of the day, her husband a spirit of the night. Erfriha was a woman of the land, Mirza a man of the sea. Mirza understood the crushing weight of time in which air existed. In return, air gifted pieces of its ancient self to Mirza, old things shaped to near shapelessness by 1,000 years beneath the waves. Mirza was a man dedicated to finding the sacred in the forgotten, the neglected, and took wisdom from them. After many decades, Mirza had a small collection of such gifts, such that they could be held in two cupped hands. But in them he understood the lifespan of a world, and so he had struck an accord with the creatures of the sea. For her part, in her times alone, Elfriha came to know the birds and animals of the plains, and likewise struck an accord with them. Even the tortured Eidelons, creatures of this world and the next, left them in peace, and made the lands around the tower safe for the Ostrons. At the center of this place was the tower, and within the tower was the Unum, the voice, the force that had called Mirza and Elfriha there so many years ago for this exact purpose. But the Unum is a being for another time, and another story. The Ostrons named their village Carifomil, family and prosperity. Elfriha was overjoyed to see her clade again, but Mirza would not enter Carifomil, for he had no family save Elfriha. Elfriha was drawn to her clade, and Mirza felt no resentment. She would one day return to them. Mirza had known it would be so. Mirza took the things the sea had gifted him over his long life and took to his boat and sailed out across his midnight ocean. He returned those gifts to the deep, and himself to them too. But this was no death into which Mirza stepped, for a world is made of cycles upon cycles. Mirza stepped into his midnight ocean, falling down into it. And the deeper he sank, the larger he became. This is how the oceans of came to be the home of the 1,000-year fish, legendary, vast, reclusive, the rare sight of which changes men. One of the great ancient spirits of The spirits of the land felt Elfriha's sadness, mad with grief for the loss of their friend to the spirits of the sea. The accord broke down, the animals and Eidelons returning once more to wildness. And so the people of the clade, Yingbin Dunyai, rebuilt the great Oricon wall that had, in centuries gone by, ringed their gleaming tower, and never again ventured out at night. The villagers decided as one that their home would no longer be known as Carifamil, family and prosperity. From that day forward, it would be known as Cetus, landless, of no one clade, home to any who are blown as dust on the wind. Elfriha lived there the rest of her days, and for the remainder of her nights, she held vigil atop the walls of Cetus, looking to the sea, and, some say, occasionally catching sight of a great fish, like an island in a midnight ocean, looking back at her with love. It is said that Mirza continued to watch over the deep, as he had always done, and Elfriha the land. Often she would stand by her husband's sea, speaking in the language only those bound at the soul can know. When the day came, and Elfriha passed from the world, her family buried her on the land. A great fish watched from the sea, and kept vigil over her for 10 days and nights. When it sank beneath the waves, it was never seen again. Some say Mirza, the 1,000-year fish, waits to this day for their story to be retold, relived, that he and Elfriha, his great love, may one day be reunited again. This is Onkko, Cetus archivist, with my translation of the tale of the wife of the earth and the husband of the sea.
Hi guys, my name's Subtutor, I'm the man of the Silver Mountain, and welcome back. Now, you've just heard the hidden messages from Onkko, from the 1,000-year fish fragments, and it's quite an expansive legend, but compared to the legend of Gara that we took a look at last week, it's got a much more kind of mythic feel to it. I feel like there are some reasons for that, and we'll get into those in a minute. But first off, because it's relevant to some stuff that we're going to be talking about later, I want to talk about where these fragments actually come from. So they come from the 1,000-year fish that look like that, and they are these glass fish scattered across the plains of Eidolon that seemingly have messages coded into them, possibly through the way that they refract light, or through patterns in the inside or outside of the glass on a minute scale that allow our instruments on our ship, our codex, to our scanners, to pick up the information from them and use it. However, that's less important in regards to what we're going to be talking about and why I'm touching on this now. What's more important is to consider that they are actually Tralloc, which is a type of fish that, according to this, strong predatory fish with eyes that can pierce the darkest shadows. Again, that's somewhat relevant. But then, more to the point, they if you're looking to actually find them, then they're only showing up at the ocean during the day. But anyway, so we've gone through the whole both of these legends now, in terms of Onkko being so kind as to read them to us. And so, as we did with the last one, I'm now going to go through it like bit by bit, and some of these parts in this particular legend are far shorter, so it'll be quicker to go through to a degree. But we've got a lot of information here, but it's less directly and obviously stated. Where with the Gara situation, it was very much a case of, well, yeah, this seems to basically be what happened, where you had a sentient descend on Earth, attack all of these Orokin towers and cities, and wipe them out. And it was only when it got to this apparently relatively small tower that it got slowed down, but there's something different about the Unum tower and so on and so forth, which is kind of more than what the other towers and other citadels had. And that's not just to say that it had a Gara, because Gara was fairly hopeless until she basically suicided on the sentient in a last-ditch attempt to kill it with an explosive from the Unum itself. But that legend seemed to be more of a historical account, whilst here we've got a lot more stuff that's very vague. And so I want to keep that in mind as we're going through it, because, you know, where stuff from the Gara legend seemed to be very direct. It was, yes, this was a historical set of happenings that transpired. Here, it seems to be a lot more, I want to say, folklore-y in the way that it's presented, where there's a lot more discussion of spirits and like weird goings on and stuff like that, whereby we're probably going to have to try and read between the lines a little bit. But anyway, in the age after the fall of the Orokin, the grand clade families, which I think we can take as clans, of the Ostron, which again, we don't know what the Ostron was initially, because we've seen how kind of other bits and pieces have fallen into place post collapse. The corpus was already a prophet cult of a sort that stemmed from the intermediate classes or intermediate castes in Orokin society. The Grineer were the lowest, kind of most menial labor class caste in Orokin society, and then post collapse, because there were just so many of them to keep infrastructure running, they became a veritable army in and of their own right. But of the Ostron, it's not just the Ostron families, it's of the Ostron. So the Ostron was a thing, a defined thing. Could it have been a ship? Could it have been a colony of some description that was spacefaring, a station, something like that? One of the Orokin towers sat out in space somewhere. We don't know. But it's interesting to note that it's not just a generalized thing. These people were clan families in and around a specific thing or place. And it was a case of whatever the Ostron was, it wasn't enough to keep them all together through the collapse of the Orokin Empire. It caused them to, as it says here, be cast wide across the solar system, roaming and homeless in their in their great floating markets, rather. So they were always traders, but they're definitely not corpus, for instance. And so as a result, we've got this weird kind of separation between what we've seen in some of the other civilizations, where they seem to be much, much less advanced. You know, they aren't as spacefaring, or if they are spacefaring, it's due to the fact that they have one preternatural thing that aids them in doing so. You know, as we saw with I can't remember the name of the small group of people that we saw in Glass Gambit, but you know, it's a case of a lot of the other places, the society on Mars that Barakatir came from, you know, they seemed far less advanced. The individuals that we saw in Glass Gambit had this pseudo-spiritual attachment to certain elements instead of using scientific knowledge and experimentation to find a way past their predicament. They just took it as this spiritual thing that was a given, and so they went with it. The Ostrons are far more proactive, active, and whilst they're all very chilled out, and whilst they do take certain things for granted, they have the Quills who seem to be very investigative in and of their own right. And so having them all come from this one place, and yet have this very different set of attitudes, kind of makes me want to know what the Ostron was initially. But anyway, you had Urfriha was from the Yingbindunyai clade, meaning Great Bond, who were an old and wealthy collection of families. Now, the thing to note here is that, again, we've seen that is a mispronunciation of Earth that they use time and time again. And so Frija was already, according to this, was already marked as being attached to the Earth even before she got to Earth, which, again, here we're looking at it from a very slanted perspective, from kind of, you know, we're looking back through time, but not only are we looking back through time, we're looking at it as through probably an oral history that has become a bit of a game of whispers over time, where, you know, one person has said one thing to another person and it's just cascaded, and because the character's name is just a specific thing, that's a thing that's been picked up and kept there. So chances are she was just Frija initially, but she becomes attached to Earth and an Earth spirit, as stated later. But so she's from within this, and that's within that Ostron organization. That's fine. Then you have Mersa, who, again, Mer seems to be related to the sea, as per various languages anyway, in the real world. But it's again, that's probably just a conflation of what he was eventually called with what he was initially called. But he had no clade. His family had been shattered by the Grineer many years before. He was Cetus, meaning landless, cladeless, a body turned to dust, turned to motes on a careless wind, and where, you know, they were the complete opposite of one another. But the thing to note here is that at this point, it's not just a case of the Grineer are disconnected forces, as we see with Bilsa in the Cephalon the Samaris fragments, Samaris imprints. They are seemingly a larger collective to one extent or another. And that might be a little bit of a jump, but again, we've seen that at the very least it's been referenced that it's been a millennia since the fall of the Orokin. The 1,000-year fish, for instance, you know, suggesting that it has been potentially that amount of time since the old status quo collapsed and the new has kind of become the norm. And so where it's landless, where he in particular has had his family stripped from him by the Grineer, And he wasn't an Ostron. He was from outside it, because it specifically says that he was cladeless. And the various Ostron bits and pieces, as we see here, they are, the whole place is made up of clades and clans all working together. He seems to have either been part of the Ostron and then had it kind of stripped away, or it's a case of he wasn't an Ostron and he came from a similar organization of some sort outside of it. There's not enough really there to say specifically one way or the other. But to Earthfriher, Mercer was a poet, had eyes to see the beauty of things and ears to hear the soft whispering languages of the universe. And he says, I know a place where I may be homeless no more. I have heard a voice and it leads me there. Come with me. So it seems like the Unum is able to reach out and touch people, bring them in. And we've not experienced this yet. I'm not sure if we ever will. I would imagine that we might. But in this regard, it's Mercer has a particular quality of someone that is seeking truth. And where we see someone that is very similar to this, that was then also taken in by the Unum, was with Onkko himself, where these transmissions come from before he leaves his wife and goes and hides in his little cave. Not particularly well hidden, but he goes off and does those things, and yet he was inquisitive and he was finding things out and dealing with things in the past. And so it seems like those are the kind of individuals that the Unum calls out for, investigators, people who are aware, people who can keep track of things and work things out. Which, again, if we're looking at the Unum as a kind of supercomputer that connects people together once they've consumed its temple kuva, then that would make sense that you would want your agents out in the world to also be particularly useful fact finders. But Earthfriher's father was a man made foolish by wealth, and he disapproved of them getting together, but they essentially went their own way, which is fine. But the next thing that stands out here is that the moon had been removed from normal space by Lotus, seemingly at this point, by Lotus either through her agents or through her directly. And yet the thing that stands out here is that they took it as the moon had disappeared as a kind of conduit or a main passing kind of landmark of the new afterlife in their beliefs. And considering that the moon seemed to be the seat of power for the Orokin Empire, and how it seemed to be that the Orokin would it would be very exclusive up there, it would be very well controlled, and it would only be the highest classes there. Having lower classes who had already deified the Orokin, the Emperors, the Seven, already, seeing the moon disappear and having them assume that that's in some way connected to the collapse, the amount of death that's going on, a new afterlife or an afterlife that they can buy into, it all makes sense. There's a cascade of thinking there that adds up. It's not true, but you can see where they were coming from. But yeah, but decades later, so after they've run away, they've been gone for decades, they went to this place that Mercer heard, which seems to be the Unum Tower that reached out to him. But then ships turning up around ancient Ur's orbit, which again we can take as Earth quite happily, and the planet's poisoned surface. So this again gives us a bit of a time period for when this may very well have been. So we've got this 1,000-year period between the collapse of the Orokin Empire and the present day in the game, that seems to be established through these particular lore fragments. And as a result, they've got this. We've got this great span of time that our characters have basically been asleep. It's no wonder that our memories have degraded over that time because of the way that we were woken up and how shaky things have been, considering that also that's a lot of time to be kept inactive, you know. And so kind of looking at this, you've got now this big contrast between what they're suggesting here and what we're seeing. Because what we're seeing now on Earth and what we saw at various points on Earth from the past was that you had things like Sarin being designed to take on the infestation that was on Earth and elsewhere to crush it. You had Sylvanas basically uploading herself into the forest and Titania turning up to try and help her do that, to reclaim and heal the planet. But then also we look at the plains of Eidolon, and I mean they're marred now by crashed sentience and the Grineer turning back up, but for the most part they're pretty idyllic. You know, rolling hills, lush vegetation, you know, big open expanses of seemingly clear water, which granted has been polluted, but it's still a case of there's a lot there that wouldn't suggest it was poisoned or deadly or anything like that. Which again then leads us to go, okay, well this might have been just after the fall, or a little way after the fall. That's a considerable amount of time now that this has been left. And these individuals, Mersa and Freya, you know, they left. They had been there for decades. They were older, significantly older by the time that they were rediscovered, and they had found a way to survive, probably through the Unam's help. But the planet's seemingly poisoned surface wasn't as poisoned as people thought. Yeah, so she asked about her clade and how her and her husband were happy where they were living and all that kind of thing. But eventually people came looking for her, and she was rather unsurprisingly happy about it, you know, as you'd expect. But then, you know, she suggested that they come and make their home around the huge Orokin tower, and the walls seem to have been destroyed, put into significant disrepair, possibly as a result of the last fights with the sentient, who knows. But she promised it would be a source of prosperity for generations, which it has been, you know. And they turned up and they re-established their market on the ground instead of it being in space. And it seems like they used the Unum as some kind of lighthouse in a way to draw people towards it. But then we see a power of the Unum that we've not really seen since, and I don't know why. Because we've got the Grineer that saw these people coming to settle there, and they didn't like it, so they sought to block their passage. They, you know, came to try and attack the tower. But their radio transmissions were silenced, their engines on their ships stopped, and their weapons were reduced to just inactive, inoperable lumps of metal. Now, transmissions being silenced, I mean, that kind of... we see some of that, but not much. Like, most of what we actually see in the game is that we can still happily send transmissions from the planes. Same with engines of ships turning cold. Like, us being Tenno, with our arc wings and things, it would make sense if we were still able to potentially fly. But when it comes to air traffic in and around the plains of Eidolon, it's mostly Grineer forces. You know, you've got dropships coming in. You've got the Dagrin speeders type things that are zipping around all over the place and trying to hunt you down. They are definitely able to fire off their weapons. So this raises the question of, is this because the Unum Tower has been harvested and as a result it has lost some of its functionality and capabilities, even though it regenerates over time? Or is there something else amiss that has led to it no longer being able to just disable weapons and ships? Which again, I would also point out in regards to what I mentioned before about how I feel, and which I'll explain at length in the video I want to do specifically on the Unum. Like we know that one of the reasons why the Orokin had difficulty fighting the Sentients was because Sentients could turn their own technology back against them. Being able to disable weaponry, turn off ship engines and things, kill transmissions, all sounds like something that the Sentients would be more than capable of doing. But anyway, she was a being of the day, her husband a spirit of the night. Now, whether or not that's being figurative or not, who knows? Probably not, but by this point there's a good chance that they had imbibed of the Temple Kuva, and as a result were in some way part of the Unum's greater network. But she was a woman of the land, he was a man of the sea, but Mercer understood the crushing weight of time in which existed. Now again, the one person that we can seemingly draw contrast with here is Onkko, because again he talks to us about numerous multiple timelines, how we've met before, how the universe works in cycles, and also realize the comparison here where he also was kind of stripped away from his wife, as we see later on in this story. Onkko was stripped away from his missus as a result of his endeavors and his connection to the Unum. So when we're seeing these cycles taking place, it's, you know, seemingly an ongoing thing, to one extent or another. But he understands the breadth of time that the Earth has gone through, you know, the prior generations of humanity that led up to the Orokin in the first place, the millennia that has happened since the fall of the Orokin, the possibly thousands of years that the Orokin actually reigned. But as a result, in return for his understanding and his inquisitiveness, he was gifted parts of Earth's ancient self, seemingly, I would imagine, Orokin items. And it says that they were worn down by the sea and all the rest of it, which again makes sense considering also that if we go to one of the underwater tile sets on Earth, which I think is Mariana, the one that's the underwater. It's very similar in. I mean, it's literally the same tile set as Uranus, but at the same time, we see through the various windows and portholes that at the bottom of the sea there, we do still have on Earth Orokin ruins, which, granted, if they added a specific Earth tile set for it, then things may change. But at the moment, from what we actually see in the game, we've got Orokin ruins at the bottom of the sea as well. So yeah, there would probably be a substantial amount of tech from both Sentients and Orokin hidden down there. You know, I wouldn't put it past the Orokin as such an ambitious and technologically capable people to have things like arcologies built out on the sea. But yeah, and then he took wisdom from them, so he was learning from them and learning as much as possible, which, you know, it's important to realize that him learning, him working things out and so on is, again, what Onkko has been doing, and how it can all work out. But after many more decades, seemingly, he had a small collection, and as a result, he could understand the lifespan of a world, which again, using that information to calculate, or being assisted by the Unum based on evidence that he finds and the computational power of the tower, he may very well be able to fully understand the lifespan of the world as it has transpired thus far. But as a result, he supposedly struck an accord with the creatures of the sea. Now, whether or not that means more Temple Coover involved, whether or not that means something else, who knows? But for her part, in her times alone, Friha came to know the birds and animals of the plains, and likewise struck an accord with them. Even the tortured Eidelons, creatures of this world and the next, left them in peace and made the lands around the tower safe for the Ostrons. Now, the animals and birds and things, that makes sense, because we've already seen Temple Coover being used in them. That's how the sentient that became the Eidolons kind of learned that that was where it needed to attack. But the thing that's interesting is we've also got the tortured Eidelons, the Eidelons themselves, these sentient beings, also being peaceful. Now, this could be hyperbole. This could be exaggeration. But again, if we've got an individual who's connected to the Unum, and the Unum seems to have an awful lot in common with sentience, and there's more that I could say about that, which I'll leave for the next video along. But in regards to that as an idea, it's entirely possible that the Unum in some way, especially when it was whole, before it was harvested, it could use its tech, its capabilities, to send out signals that would suggest to the Eidelons, these half-broken, unthinking, only feeling things, that though the Ostrons and the other creatures around them were all not just safe and helpful, but potentially masking them as either completely invisible or as other sentients, and therefore not to be messed with. But at the centre of this place was the tower, and within the tower was the Unum, the voice, the force that had called Mersa and Airfira there so many years ago for this exact purpose. But the Unum is a being of another time, or for another time and another story, because of course it is, because they can't tell us all that much about it, and I don't think we're going to find anything else about it in the sacrifice, because the sacrifice seems to be focused towards the Warframes. I think we've still got a fair while to wait before we start finding out about the Unum. But as a result, though, we've got this tower that's at the core of everything here, where the voice that called out, the force that has protected them, it's a lot of so many interesting elements here, and yet also the point to note is that they had been called specifically for this purpose. They had been called as people to handle the goings on outside of the tower. I feel like this is the story of the first Quills, essentially, in their current iteration. But the Ostrons named their village something pretentious, and Afria was happy with this because family. Mersa wasn't because family, and it's fair enough. And again, though, we've got Mersa feeling no resentment. He's not bothered by this at all, and he understands that things are going to transpire over time. And he had known it would be so. So there was no jealousy, no upset, no anything like that, because he already had this grand understanding of what had happened and what was going to happen next. But in doing this, in seeing the way the settlement had been kind of created and the way that everyone was interacting, he then takes the things that he has been gifted to his boat and jumps in the ocean, essentially. It points out that this was no death. And again, this is where we've got the point of cycles upon cycles, which again, possibly we will see Onkko move on at some point. But again, we saw what kind of fish, in theory, it's turned into, which is the Tralloc here. which, again, he's a spirit of the night. The Tralloc turns up on near the shores during the day, seemingly, because that's when we can catch them. But otherwise, it's a dark water kind of deep predator, seemingly, which, again, you would potentially see more of that being associated with a spirit of the night, a creature that can see pretty well in the dark. But he steps into the oceans, and on falling down, the deeper he sank, the larger he became. This is how the oceans of came to be the home of the 1,000-year fish, legendary, vast, reclusive, and the rare sight which changes men, one of the great spirits of Now, this could be an Orokin machine. It could be Orokin tech that has changed him. It could be something completely different. It could be the interactions that we are aware of in regards to Temple Kuva in significant enough a dose could have metamorphic capabilities. For instance, we don't know exactly how Lotus, considering she seems to be a sentient, holds the form of a human woman. We don't know why Hunhao also seems particularly humanoid in the moments when he pops up to have a quick chat. And again, it points out that this is one of the great ancient spirits of which I think we can take as being a creature or being of great power, which means it could be a ship, to be fair. It could be all kinds of things that Mercer either turned into or found or whatever else. But at the same time, it could be something metamorphic. Part of me is leaning more towards the technological angle rather than something metamorphic, but we have to entertain both ideas until we actually have some more information. The spirits of the land felt her sadness, mad with grief from the loss, and so on and so forth. But again, her husband has always been incongruous with the spirits of the sea, so I feel like there's something here that's missing, and it might be decidedly so, and somewhat obvious, but who knows. But the accord broke down due to Friha's distress, which again, if she's tied into the Unum, emotional feedback, we've seen how somatic links and things get shaky when certain people interfere and how certain things get passed across them. If there's something similar going on with the Unum and the Quills, then it would be understandable that someone who had such a significant and probably hopeless and miserable response, emotional response, would cause a bit of a collapse in what was going on. But again, it points out here that the entire Yingban Dunyai clade took to rebuilding the Orokin wall around Cetus, or what would become Cetus. And so it's a case of, we've seen that some of the towers where the barrier is up have been damaged and knocked down. We've seen the damage to various places in and around Cetus itself, but it would appear that over time, or due to the last fight with the Sentient, some of those main defences got taken out. And, as a result, they rebuilt them and then never ventured out again at night, which, that's what they leave us to go and do. But at which point they then, seeing all of this going on, and again, where they say they decided as one that their home would no longer be called Cara Femil, there's something else that stands out to me, and that is that if all of them at this point have imbibed at least some of the Temple Kuva, then potentially that sudden decision may very well have been directly influenced by Friha and her emotional state, because they would all be in some way linked up and connected. But as a result, and also this as an idea where they recall it Cetus and it's landless, cladeless, and whoever turns up can come be there and whatever else, that makes that's going to be such an advantage to the Unum itself, where much more information from many more sources without directly contributing things like Temple Kuva, having feedback from people's emotional states again when it's not necessary and could cause damage. We've got all those kind of things, but also after that you had her kind of keeping a vigil atop the walls and occasionally seeing the great fish like an island in the midnight ocean looking back at her with love. Now again, part of me thinks, okay, so if he's gone and if old man Mercer has gone and found an old Orokin ship, or a submersible of some description, and so occasionally he's coming back up to just see what's going on because he loved his missus, then it stands out that it might look like this big fish sat in the distance on top of the water, but again, she's seeing this at night. Like, if we read into this a little bit, it could very well be a large fish, or it could very well be a piece of tech that is being piloted. So, hey ho. But then he continued to watch over the deep and had always done so and heard the land. But then, she would speak in a language only those bound at the soul can know, which, again, somatic link where we're able to talk to Lotus and she's able to talk back, where we're connected to our warframes, how the sentients are all connected as a kind of hive mind and are able to interact and interface with one another. The fact that the quills, at the very least Onkko, seems to have a direct kind of psychic bond to the tower as a result, that provides him with its computing power for all of his understanding of possible futures and cycles, in which case the language only those bound at the soul can know. Could they have been communicating more readily than not, him aboard some kind of Orokin or vessel, and her by just being within a certain range? It's something to question. But then, eventually she died. So even though they have very long lives, even though potentially her life was elongated by the Temple Kuva, she passed away, her family buried her and all the rest of it, and then the great fish apparently watched from the sea and kept a vigil over her for 10 days and 10 nights. Which again, if a large ship has just turned up and sat there watching the proceedings and Mercer beginning his mourning and all the rest of it, then you would imagine that it would probably sit there for a good number of days. But then it sank beneath the wave and was never seen again, probably because Mercer eventually died on his ship as well, because otherwise he's kicking around down there still, which again, we could possibly go and meet him and find him. But then the 1,000-year fish waits to this day for their story to be retold. Realise though it's a case of retold, relived, the he would meet his great love and be reunited again, and it's a case of going, well, Onkko had that, didn't he? Where he and his missus lived out a very long and fruitful life, and yet then he moved on to being a quill, and his missus eventually moved on and got with Konzu, who is to one extent or another the leader of the civil leader in Cetus, demonstrating her connection to where she is and the people that she's with, the same way Friha did. And it's a case of going, right, so there's already been this cycle but with two different people, and it's just another trait of people's behaviour. But then also no 1,000-year fish involved in their story specifically. So it's a cycle of the kind of elements of the story, but it's not a cycle of the truth of the story, which again, possibly, as we move forward, as we learn more about the Unum, maybe Onkko will be sent to go and find the 1,000-year fish, whatever it is, and we will be there to help him. Be it a piece of tech, be it a creature, be it some combination of both. you know, it's something that we may well end up looking into, and I kind of hope we do, just so we get some more information on this. But anyway, guys, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, especially before I go into the next video, where the next video is going to be all speculation and me trying to throw out my ideas on what the Unum actually is, from both what we've already discussed in terms of the legends, the ways that it's interacted with things, but also some stuff that we see in game. But otherwise, guys, I'd love to hear your thoughts, just to give me some food for thought before I get into recording that video in the coming few days. And otherwise, guys, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the video tomorrow. Take care. Thank you very much for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this video or found it interesting, please drop us a like, share this video, and subscribe for more. And I'll see you in the video tomorrow. Take care.